Steve Milmucker, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right, thank you, mate. I've got a guest with me. This is my little dog. She's
Yes.
just decided to jump up on me. So if you hear a rattling of chains, it's not me.
That's right. Igor.
Yeah.
What breed?
She's a Jack Russell.
Ah, a ratter.
Yeah, a little rat dog.
They're very affectionate.
Yeah, she's a very beautiful girl, but I call her a little Minger dog. She's just a little Minger.
Right. You need to explain to the non-English listener what that means.
Yeah, well, a Minger is just something that's just like a drossy, horrible little thing. I have a love-hate relationship with her in that I love to hate her.
Dogs take on or mirror our own personalities here, Steve.
This is why this is my wife's dog.
Marvellous. Anyway, what we're talking about today?
Well, I think it would be quite interesting, and just seeing where we come through on this, is to look at some books that have shaped us in terms of the way that we think or the way that we have grown. And maybe we take, 3 books each or something like that and see where we come from and see if we have any point of convergence. That would be quite interesting.
One may think, listening to us when we introduce our topics, that we've just thought them up. But no, I have to say, I found this very difficult. How do I condense them down into 3 that has any meaning? It's all the ones I've left out that keep preying on my mind. But there's no honorary mentions here, are there? We're just going to go straight into the books.
Well, I mean, let the conversation flow, Mark, because you might find that you pick up on the one book and then you can tease out these other books that have run sort of in tandem with it. There are no hard and fast rules here, matey.
Well, you'll need to rein me in then. This is your subject, so you can kick off, sir.
Again, I really struggled with this because, as you know, and as you have seen from some of what you can see in my study, I have books everywhere. And as you know, I even still have the old book that you gave me back in 83, 84, whenever it was, that encyclopedia of the Bible that you gave me. So I've got books everywhere, and it is a very, very difficult thing to do. And so I put a lot of thinking into it, and I went right back into my childhood, actually. So rather than sitting in my adult world, I went as far back as I could. And one of the first books that really started to fire my imagination up was a book by Enid Blyton and the story of Mr. Pink Whistle.
Which you can't see, he's actually holding. He's got it in his hand.
And I haven't got my pink whistle in my hand. I've got the book in my hand. The book, Mr. Pink Whistle.
Here's a question. Did she choose that name deliberately? Is it something underneath that we should be thinking about?
Double entendre in there.
Yeah.
There may well be. Frankly, I don't care. If there is, I don't care. What I loved about this series of books, I had all of them. I think I've probably only got that one. Maybe another one if looking across on a bookcase over there. What I really loved about this was I was a young kid, right? So I was probably only 5 years old, 6 years old when I was reading these books. And they captured my imagination at that early stage. You've got to remember, this is back in the day when we didn't have mobile phones, we didn't have televisions in rooms, there was no video recorders, there were no CDs, even cassette tapes. It was Super 8 tapes, it wasn't cassette tapes.
Yeah.
You know?
No internet.
No internet. We didn't have torches in our house. We used to have candles in our house for if the lights went out and the electricity got cut off. There might be one big torch and it would be in a cupboard under the stairs and it would be like a dirty, great big dragon lamp. So I used to make little torches out of a battery with a bit of wire taped to the bottom and then a little bulb that I'd sit on the top. And so I'd go to bed, and because I was never allowed my light on because lights were out at a certain time, and then I'd pull the covers over and I'd pull this little battery out from my pillowcase and I'd hold the little wires on the bottom and on the top, and I'd make a little torch, and then I'd lay there reading by this tiny bulb, Mr. Pink Whistle. And Mr. Pink Whistle was all about setting things right. He had this sense of justice. If he saw somebody being hurt, if he saw a kid being bullied, he would go out of his way to make it right. And he could do it because he was half brownie, half human. So he lived in this really interesting space. He was never accepted by the brownies because they were a little bit suspicious of him because he was half human. He was never accepted by the humans because he had these strange little quirky powers. But he had a little black cat called Sooty that used to be his oppo, that used to hang around with him. And one of his sort of magic powers was being invisible. So he could go and right these wrongs by being invisible and just turning the tables on the baddies, on the bullies, on the bad guys, on the people that were doing the harm. And so there was this sense of justice,
Yeah.
which is quite bizarre. Became a detective, right? But there was this
Yes.
very deep-rooted sense of justice, looking out for people that were being hurt, doing things right so that you could benefit and change their life.
And was there much artwork in the book? It wasn't all just text, was it?
No, it wasn't all just text. So there's, typical sort of artwork back in the day, have the sort of ink outlines and all of that sort of thing. No colour in the pages.
Is it from the Second World War? When was it published?
I'll have a quick look in this as I've got it. So 1950, and this one that I had is a 1970 publication. So it was post-Second World War that she wrote this, as far as I'm aware. Certainly that particular one.
Because the artwork gives the impression it's Victorian almost, doesn't it? What he's wearing.
Yeah. Well, he's like a little elfy type creature, isn't he? A brownie.
Right.
Brownie not in the sense of Girl Guides brownie, but brownie in the sense of elf, fairy, fae people, the little fae people. I read this to my kids when they were little because I obviously had my old storybooks and I used to read it to them. And when I read it, he was always like a little leprechaun. He'd talk like that.
Enjoying the crack.
He'd have this little voice like that. And it'd be like, Mr. Pinkwhistle. Oh, that's Mr. Pinkwhistle indeed. And so they loved him. For me, he set something in my thinking around justice, fairness, looking out for people that are being treated bad by other folk. So that actually shaped something in me. Long time ago, say probably 5 years old.
And did you read any more from Enid Blyton?
Yeah, of course I did. So I read all of them, Brer Rabbit, Binky and Flip, all the way through Famous Five, Secret Seven. So I had all of those. And so that whole genre as I was growing up was very formative in terms of how you viewed the world and doing the right thing.
I was always into Rupert the Bear. The thing about him, it wasn't necessarily the stories, it was the artwork. Was it Nutwood? And all the trees, whoever the artist was, superb. I loved it. But it's not on my list.
No, but there we go. That's sort of one that shaped me from very early on. And I've sort of tracked through from there. But so go for you. What's one of the ones that's shaped your thinking?
Right. So I would have been about 11, and I'd just gone to the big school, which was secondary school in the English, and if it was a New Zealand system. For those in Canada or the States, I don't know what the equivalent grade is. I was about 11 years old. And I tell you what it was, Steve. It was a school not that very old. It was the typical glass frontages where they used to put like plastic squares, red and green and blue and all that kind of stuff on the front. And I must have, one lunchtime, gone to the library. Now, I don't remember the lady concerned, her name, but I remember she was tall, slim, and silver hair. She's probably 30 odd for all I know, but she's, in my mind, ancient. And she must have asked some questions, what you're after and what kind of things you into. And she took me down one little corner of the library and she picked off this huge, massive book, put it into my hand, and on reflection, she was absolutely spot on. And it's Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. And what fascinated me about looking back at this is that she didn't give me The Hobbit. It was straight into the bigger, more dense book. So she obviously thought I could manage it, and I don't remember taking it home, but it must have had some effect. I remember two things about that book. One was, of all the characters that I associated with, it was Gollum, because he's a tragic character who was, in his own words, abandoned. No one was there for me, the song from the film. But the font, there was a unique font I'd never seen before, and I don't think I've seen afterwards. And it's when you get G italicized, the G was a circle at the top and like a tail wrapped round itself and coming back. And I was fascinated by a simple thing. Ever since, I've had a lifelong love of fonts and fantasy. So what did it lead to? It led to eventually getting into D&D and Warhammer Fantasy. I first got into Warhammer Fantasy, the 3rd edition, the late 80s. When we knew each other on the Charybdis, I gave you a copy of the Belgariad, Pawn of Prophecy, so I was obviously reading books at that time. I probably would have found the book eventually, regardless of this lady. But in my mind, she gifted me the ability to open up my imagination and to world build and to see that different cultures and people can get on with each other. It was just a fantastic point in my life, and I've never forgotten it. But unfortunately, I cannot remember her name. You ever read the book?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Tolkien and that genre, a love affair that was sparked with me as well. And, I won't go into my sort of second book yet, but you'll see how that flows through. So when you read Lord of the Rings then as a young fella, obviously sparked something in you and you recognised and saw perhaps yourself or your circumstances with different characters. How did it inspire you?
It inspired me to read more of fantasy and then to realise that you could read about goblins and elves, but still have this gritty world in which they were. It wasn't like Enid Blyton, perhaps. It was more adult.
Yeah.
And the way that Tolkien writes the books with mythology he made up, supposedly he wanted to create a mythology of Middle-earth because he felt England didn't have it. He was a philologist. He knew Anglo-Saxon. Middle-earth was the words that they used for the place where they lived.
Yeah.
Orc meant a foreigner. Yeah. So he used a lot of words and he built up this world that was, if you look at Rohan, is very Saxon. But in terms of inspired, I think, to be honest, it was it his son or his grandson, I can't remember now, who wrote Unfinished Tales. He collected all the works together, Christopher Tolkien. They inspired me more than Lord of the Rings did, funnily enough, because there's a story which I've longed wished to see made into a film, and it was Turin Turambar. He's an outcast and he's befriended by the elves and he ends up becoming a troubled warrior and the slaying of the worm. If it's inspired me, it's to look at our world differently.
The very fact that it's actually sort of lifted you from a place to another place is really interesting. The fact that a fantasy novel can translate into the real world in which we live and inspire people to improve themselves, read more books, get engaged in other things that open their thinking and their reasoning, the whole gambit. There are some purists, I'm sure, who think that science fiction fantasy is just a total waste of time.
Yeah.
I always remember my old friend Dave Gemmell, who was a very well-known international author of heroic fantasy. And he'd say, no, this is real world. He said, I just put sort of fantasy characters, but I draw from real people. So these people that I create on my keyboard are real people, but I've just given them a fantasy name. And this is a real world, but I've just given it a fantasy title. It's real stuff which is being lived out in these pages that you will see in everyday life. And that's absolutely right.
You can link in Star Trek. A lot of the themes that are set in this, make-believe world, or in fantasy, are themes that we have in the real world. But they become much more easy to face and accept if they're in a fantasy or sci-fi setting. In other words, it's lifted out of our own worries and concerns and worlds and prejudices. When you think about Star Trek, how there was the first on-screen interracial kiss.
Yep.
Well, that required that setting for that to take place. Tolkien was very interested in how we were destroying the Earth.
Yeah.
There's a green ecological message there. Although he resisted any allegories or hidden messages, for him it's just a story. But you could read into it that that is the case. Well, you wouldn't necessarily get that in another book. Or it would be too scientific, perhaps too plodding. Whereas in a fantasy story where there's fights and there's wonderful scenery, it just seeps into you when you're not really thinking about it. And that's, I think, the inspiration behind that.
It's good stuff.
But anyway, I know you're itching to get onto your next book.
So the next book that was quite significant to me, so obviously, again, I sort of tracked right back to when I was a young fella. So sort of moving on now as I'm getting older and I can deal with more complex stories and that sort of thing, was a book that was given me by my grandmother. Now, my grandmother and my mother's mother, I was very, very close to her. She was a remarkable woman. I loved her to bits, and she had an influence on me in terms of just the way that she was. You know, she was just a great woman. And I had huge love and respect for her. She was an avid reader. She played the piano beautifully. She spoke French really well. She was just a really good woman. And she encouraged me to love books. And one of the books that she gave me, she pulled this book. Funnily enough, I still have it, Mark. She pulled this book off her bookcase. The Little Grey Men by B.B. And B.B. is the pen name for the author whose name escapes me right at this moment, but I'm sure it's Dennis somebody. Anyway, it's a very unknown little book, and it was written about 1942, and this was published in 1962, this one that my nan gave me. And it's a story of the last 4 little gnomes who lived in Great Britain, in Warwickshire.
Why Warwickshire?
Warwickshire was the place that he decided gnomes would live. And if there was going to be 4 gnomes left on the planet in Britain, then Warwickshire would be the place. they've got names that went after flowers. So one was called Bald Money, one was called Sneezewort, one was called Dodder, and one was called Cloudberry. Now, Cloudberry decides that he's going to disappear off and go on an adventure. He didn't come back. And so the other three gnomes get a little bit concerned, and so they build a little boat called the Dragonfly, and they go out to find him.
Sounds like Redwall Abbey.
So it's this story of these three little gnomes as they track through the county of Warwickshire, really close to the land. So really close to all of the animals. So all of the animals have got different personalities and all the rest of it. And it just created this whole world of fantasy, like the little people in Ireland, you know, this whole world of fantasy, of connection with the earth. And it tracks their little story from they kick off in the spring, and then they go through the summer, and then into the autumn, and then just as the frost starts kicking when they return. So you get the change of the seasons, how it affects their journey, and everything that happens and goes on. And so my nan gave me that book, and I read it, and I was captivated by this world within our world, you know, this world that you couldn't see, which then led on to her giving me a copy of The Hobbit, Tolkien, and obviously tracking further down that line and Lord of the Rings, etc., up until we met in '83, and you're reading David Eddings and introduced me to David Eddings.
Oh, don't tell me you got the book still.
So they're in another bookcase in the house, which is really quite interesting because years and years later, I met Dave Gemmell, the writer of heroic fantasy. Sadly passed away in 2006. I had to go and deal with him from a professional capacity. He had an issue, and I had to go to his house to deal with this matter when I was policing, and he was a witness to something. We got chatting, and I got on with him very well while I was working for him. But then, as it came to leaving, I stepped out of his house, and he's a big guy, real big guy. And I said, "Thanks very much, Mr. Gemmell. That's great. I'll be back in touch with you when I've got some more stuff which I can talk to you about." And he said, "Oh, that's wonderful." I said, "Just a question for you." I said, "Do you write books?" And, you know, he swelled a little bit in the doorway. You know, he's a great guy. And he said, yes, I do, actually. I said, "Yeah, I've never read any of yours, mate. I think they're, I prefer another writer called David Eddings." And he went, What? Like this. And so, wait a minute. And so he goes rushing out the back, and then he comes back and he hands me a copy of Legend, which is his first novel. And he says, read that and get back to me and tell me what you think. And I went, "Yeah, I'll do that, mate." So, of course, that started a real close friendship, which lasted until he passed away, sadly. Interesting, you know, all of this journey from Mr. Pink Whistle and this sense of magic and wonder through BB and the Little Grey Men to David Eddings and the Belgariad and Tolkien and all of that before then, right up to where I was engaged with this other chap, and that friendship formed. It's fascinating. The whole thing just developed this sense of wonder, and again, so opening your mind, opening your minds to other things, and just allowing your imagination to go riot for a while. It's great stuff.
It's true, it does benefit you. I did from vanilla World of Warcraft, and I introduced others to it, and then around about 2010, I can't remember, was that Wrath of the Lich King by then? I can't remember, I've lost track. Articles started coming out about the benefit of fantasy in the workplace. A lot of people who were going for interviews were referencing WoW, and it was being used by scientists to track. They had, I've got to think of the times here now, World of Warcraft kept bringing in these add-ons. So there was the Burning Crusade, the Wrath of the Lich King, and there was the one where the world was destroyed, and before it was brought in, they put like a plague into the world, and scientists tracked it, how plague was carried around. If plague was in an area, it required a player's character to come along, pick it up and carry it around. They were never affected, but they wanted to track how these things spread. And it formed part of an understanding of pandemics.
It's unbelievable.
This cross-fertilization that was used. So there is a real power in these made-up worlds, because it often gets us to think obliquely.
Yeah, so that was another little book that influenced me anyway, mate. Little Grey Men by BB. If you can get hold of a copy, it's worth reading. It's a real quaint little story, and I think that he wrote it with a very clear understanding of what's going on in the world and how things were being shaped. And you've got good guys and bad guys that these little gnomes meet along, and you could probably read into all sorts of different things. as to the humans and what they were doing and how they were doing things and affecting all of the ecology that was going on unseen below them. Fascinating little story. Timeless. Really, really great little genre.
I think we both agreed then. We both like fantasy.
Young at heart, mate. For the young at heart. Not a kid's book, but for the young at heart. What's sort of next up on your list that you can think of then?
So this needs a bit of a setup. About the time I got into Lord of the Rings, I was reading contemporary books. My chance to mention some of the ones that make the list. So I was reading anything that came out by James A. Michener. Loved his books, especially Centennial. And then The Source, which was set in the Holy Land, and he did Poland and space in the 80s. But it turns out, even as a young teenager, I was attracted to authors from past centuries. For some reason, wanting to get the books of, say, Tobias Smollett, Edmund Burke, anything by Aphra Behn, Mary Wollstonecraft, William Hazlitt, Thomas Carlyle. And that's never changed. 16th, 17th, 18th century. Anything up to Bertrand Russell, something like that. And when you read their books, their works, a couple of things immediately jump out. You can't ignore it. They tend to pepper their works, their script, so to speak, with mythology from Greece. So I was thinking, who's this Aphrodite they keep talking about? Who is this person, Hera? And then there's Latin. What does it mean, dulce decorum est? What are they talking about? And quotations from scripture. With the Greek and the Latin, it took years to fill in the gaps because, as you said, there was no internet. If you didn't have a library of any worth nearby, you had to wait to find a bookstore that would sell something. And luckily, there were lines of classics and you could pick them up. And I remember being on HMS Aurora and the petty officer signals there had got the Iliad and he had 2 books of it, and he gave me the first while he was reading the second, and we were eagerly getting together, and he said, I think I worked out how to pronounce this word, things like that. The one that was easy to get hold of was Scripture, the Bible. And so my second book is the Bible. Yeah. It has had a profound effect on me. But I need to open up now and state that I have a degree, it's art design, theology and philosophy. I taught religious studies, not instructed. It's studying religions and world faiths and philosophy and ethics in the UK. I absolutely love theology, the ideas of what it means to be God, ontology, what's it all aiming for, the eschatology. But I am not a follower of faith. I wanted to be like those writers, so I wanted to know what they were talking about. I was born into the Church of England. I've been to churches. I support those who want to be Christian, but I am not religious. I don't call myself an atheist. That's just a term to bracket. I appreciate the role of the Bible in history. I think it is a sublime piece of work that anybody should read. And so I've lit the paper, Stephen. I'm going to sit back and let you talk.
Gosh, goodness me. Well, that's quite funny that should come out, Mark, because the third book that would probably have had the most profound impact on my life would be the Bible. And when I say the Bible, I'm talking about the Hebrew scriptures, the Tanakh. So the old Hebrew scriptures and the New Covenant, or what's called the New Testament. So in the English, we have, if you're Protestant, it would be the 66 books by 40 different authors contained in the Old Testament and the New Testament. If you're Catholic, you would have all of that, plus some Apocrypha, which is chucked in, which is
Maccabees and things like that.
Yeah. So the Jubilees and other bits and pieces. So when I'm talking about the Bible, I guess I'm speaking predominantly around like the Hebrew Tanakh, the Hebrew Old Testament, and then the New Testament was written in the Greek. That's been a fascinating book. Now, obviously, the society that we grew up in was still very much underpinned by a Judeo-Christian culture. So even if you were an atheist, you couldn't get away from the fact that you'd go to school, there would be an assembly at school, there'd be prayers said, there'd be hymns sung. And so we grew up with all of that. And most of us were thrown into a Church of England church at some point to go to a Sunday school. And so
I went to Sunday school,
yeah. So you grew up with Jonah and the whale stories, Daniel and the lion's den, and all of these different biblical accounts. So there is something that's been seeded into you very early on. Not that that's a bad thing, but I guess you have to come to it from a position of, I would say, maturity. You shouldn't have a Sunday school faith in terms of how you look at what I would call the scriptures, the Tanakh and the New Testament. Probably, 2006, and I've already mentioned this, 2006, Dave Gemmell passed away. When I'd come back from England attending his funeral, I sat at my computer and I was really upset by losing him. and I looked up and there was an old Bible up on the shelf. And so I pulled it off and I decided that what I would do is I would apply my detective training to the scripture to show why it was a crock of crap and to disprove it, to show that it was just all total nonsense. Now, if anybody decides that they're going to do that, I would warn you beforehand that if you do that with a detective mindset, which is you will be open and you will go where the evidence takes you, then you might find that you get a bit unstuck. And I found that I got a bit unstuck with it, in the footsteps of Lord Lyttelton and his friend Gilbert West, who did a very similar thing, and they ended up being convinced that actually there's more to this book than they thought it was. Frank Morrison, who wrote the book probably in the 70s, Who Moved the Stone, he wrote it to show that there was no such thing and it didn't happen. Well, he found that actually he had to readdress his thoughts around that. More recently, Lee Strobel, who wrote The Case for Christ, who was an atheist journalist, and he decided that he was just going to go and dismiss all of this and show how crap it was. And he ended up on a totally different position. So I found myself really challenged by the time I pulled it apart. And I had to say to myself, follow the evidence. Follow the evidence, even if you don't like where it's going to take you. And for me, there was sufficient evidential value in what I had uncovered to force me to make a decision as to whether it was true or whether it wasn't true. Some people may need 99% to get to that point before they would jump over. Some people may need 51%, 52%. I would say that I reached a point where I was like 80% satisfied at that point that there was more truth to this. Therefore, it's willing for me to step into it. And so I stepped into it. That changed, that particular moment then changed everything for me, changed my life in terms of direction of travel.
You had a road to Damascus moment, though, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I don't think I'll go into that now, but that was all part and parcel of that post the opening up the Bible and looking to try and disprove it. There was a number of other things that then happened post that event that sort of sealed the deal for me. But for me, and as I say, it will be different for everybody else, but for me, the evidence was sufficiently weighted in favour of what the text was saying that I had to come to a decision and go, well, it's either true or it isn't. What are you going to go with? And I decided that it was sufficiently weighted for me to take that step. And I guess that's probably what you term a step of faith. And you take that step, and then other things just seem to then just roll on. And we've talked about, the material world and the rational world, and there's a hell of a lot more out there than what we think and what we can see. So that became a significant point for me personally. But I would say that I'm not how would I put it? The term Christian troubles me, because the term Christian has become almost a culture, that you are from the West, therefore you are Christian, and that's absolutely nonsense.
It's become a noun and not a verb.
Yeah. So, how would I describe myself? I'd probably describe myself as a follower of Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus Messiah, Jesus the man who was a rabbi. So I follow a rabbi from the first century. I
was going to say, are you more of the pre-Nicene Creed faith?
No, because I believe in what the concept of the Nicene Creed in terms of the Godhead, right. but I don't see it in hierarchy. And I think that this is one of the problems of the church, is that some people see this God the Father up here, God the Son down here, and then God the Spirit floating around doing something fluffy, and we can't quite get our fingers on him. I see the Godhead as a unity. So it goes back all the way back to the Hebrew Tanakh. They have something called the Shema, which is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one. And in the Hebrew, that echad is the Hebrew word, echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is echad. And echad is not a singular oneness. It is a plurality, a completeness, a unity. It's not a singular number one. It's a unity in diversity. So the God of Israel is a unity in diversity. And I think that the Trinity, concept of the Trinity, is about showing the unity of the diversity of the oneness of God, which is probably a very simplistic way of trying to explain the Trinity. But for me, it works in my understanding. I recognize the value of the history of where the faith comes from. I recognized that this man, Jesus, was a Jewish rabbi. He was steeped in the Jewish Torah. He was steeped in the Tanakh. He was steeped in the law of Moses. He was raised in that context and that culture. And so I've tried to understand the scripture in the light of that. And by applying that lens on it, to me and to people that I've spoken to over the years since then, it adds colour to the book and it brings it to life in a way which I never knew when I was a youngster. Just didn't know it. It's fascinating. Yeah. So it's fascinated me. It's absolutely fascinated me. And it's not so much the book, but the God of the book. The God of the book has fascinated me because I see the God of the book actually condensed and represented in a real God man who walked this earth. But I struggle with some of the traditional tagging because I wouldn't put myself in that box.
Yeah.
The tagging is ancient. I mean, theos is a Greek word, and it means personable God that could be known and worshipped. And if you negated that, you put the A in front, and it's atheas, theos, atheist. Gnosis is knowledge, or agnosis, you don't know. But I think over time, what they've become, especially with postmodernism and this modern world, there just seem to be a bracket that means you can't move out of. All it creates is fundamental atheists who say, I will never go that way. And then you get fundamentalist Christians, well, I will never go that way. Kind of forget that it's two sides to the same coin, and they have to exist together. It's a way of looking at the world and giving meaning to people. And although I don't feel the need to go to a church, I mean, for me, the divinity, the Godhead, so to speak, is in nature.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. It's in us. But if that is something that energizes a person, I'm all for it. I'm all supportive. And could there be any more beautiful places than some churches that's been created on this earth? Just as mosques and just as temples and gurdwaras, these places that people go to. But one point in their life, or the week, I should say, think beyond themselves. Go beyond the 3D to the 5D. So I'm all for it. And if this book gives meaning to people, fantastic.
So yes, so it's interesting that book has been instrumental in both our worlds, and we almost circumnavigate it, perhaps on different latitudes and longitudes.
I think there's more in common than there is that separates.
Oh gosh, yeah, absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
And I think it would be nice if we have people that realise that.
As you know, I also now pastor a small church, and one of the things that I'm really keen on is to break down barriers within churches, because there are so many churches that are so rigid and so dogmatic in their approach that they're not doing justice to the book that they say they follow. They are just bound up in legalism, and they're bound up often a very medieval worldview. And there's some fascinating concepts, even around heaven and hell, which are just taken straight out of Dante and straight out of the medieval age. They've got nothing to do with what the Bible actually says about those two places, if indeed they are places in the sense that often we're taught that they're places. You know, you go to heaven or you go to hell. Well, that's not quite as simple as that in Scripture. In fact, the New Testament has got hardly anything to say about heaven. And the Jews didn't believe in heaven in the Platonic sense that we have now taken on, which is this disembodied soul that floats off to this place. Because this was actually Greek mythology. This is Greek philosophical teaching, Plato, which was then pushed by Plutarch.
It's the ideal. It's the ultimate form, the form of the good.
Yeah, but the whole concept of the disembodied soul floating off somewhere, well, that's never what the Judeo-Christians taught. Even that is a fascinating concept to unpack and unravel. I sort of sit in the firing line of people who don't believe in God and people who do, because I don't conform to either camp in the way that I should. You know?
There's going to be people listening to this who are going to get triggered.
Oh, probably.
Do you remember in the episode we did of leadership, I said so many leaders, so little leadership? There are people who, they've said it, so many Christians, so little Christianity. Why is it that the core teaching of Jesus, love thy neighbour, seems to be a problem for many? If you said to a Christian, there's 4 types of love, is there? There's philos, love of wisdom, philosophia. There's eros, the rumpy-pumpy type. Storge, love of place and family. And agape, brotherly love. And Jesus taught, love thy neighbour.
Yeah.
Well, if your neighbour happened to be a homosexual Muslim, would you still love them?
Yeah.
And it's amazing. I mean, oh no. Well, what's the point of the teaching then?
Yeah, it's a failure to actually understand the Scripture. It's a failure and you end up following the teachings of perhaps well-intentioned people from the past who have built into that and then built an institution into that. But you've actually got to go back to what Jesus was talking about, who he was talking to, what does he say, what doesn't he say, and there are just some fascinating conversations. And I've had conversations with people over the years, people who would say that they're Christian people, and they've just got really antsy with me about some of the stuff that I would say, because I'm saying, well, actually, what you are now teaching is not scriptural. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. No, it's not. What you're teaching is a view that has been grown from a tradition that has got nothing to do with the Bible. It's so far removed from what the original concept was. And you need to go back to the source, go back to the original concept, understanding context, and then build from there. And at the end of the day, you are following the teachings of a Jewish rabbi. And he was teaching within a Judaic culture, set within a Greek world under the oppression of a Roman Empire. And you've got to understand all of this to a degree to actually understand the nuances and the subtlety of the teaching. And
the apologia towards Rome.
Yeah, and when you do, it becomes quite an incredible story.
You mentioned the Platonic idea of heaven and stuff like that. Plato, The Last Days of Socrates. It's my third book, by the way. It's actually 3 books. The Apology, where he's on his trial. I've always thought this would be interest to you because it's where he imagines the laws embodied as a woman having an argument with him and saying, look, you were happy to live under me, but now that you've done something, you've got to follow it through. And it talks about the idea of justice, and we can't just decide, no, it doesn't suit me this time. And then your 5th row is where he famously takes the hemlock. We intimated it in a previous episode. It might have been me, actually. On the Aurora and on the Charybdis, there were cases of injustice.
Yep.
And that had an effect. I didn't know at the time the language of ethics and morals and where they came from, but it's always interested me. I was fascinated to find out when we got together again that you'd become a copper and join the law, because it was almost the same kind of interest. A profound book, both theology and philosophy, more than art, because I'm an artist, I do paintings and stuff like that. That's had an effect on me that I cannot underestimate. And it's just so nice, Steve, to be able to talk to someone like you that shares something very similar. They're my 3 books.
Brilliant. Excellent books, mate. Well, my friend, I think that we have probably about done this to death.
One would say no, Steve. We could carry on for hours, but I think you're right. In terms of this episode, perhaps we can knock it on the head, son. Thanks for that. I really enjoyed it.
Take care, fella. Bye.